Hi, I'm Dr. Christopher Miller, and welcome to this lecture on Jain Asceticism, Part 1. This first lecture on Jain Asceticism will follow Paul Dundas' book, The Jains, pages 150 through 169. As we begin this lecture, I'd like to draw our attention to the quote beneath the image of the Digambara monk in meditation. This quote says, "First knowledge of the world, then compassion for it." Comes from the Dasha Vaikalika, a Jain scripture. And what this is pointing towards is that before one has true heartfelt compassion for the world, they have to first gain proper knowledge of the world. And that proper knowledge is the knowledge that comes through the Jain insight from Mahavira, that nothing in the world wants to experience suffering. And therefore, once we have that fundamental insight, we have compassion for it. And then we develop a commitment to practicing and perfecting nonviolence. And that indeed is the path of the Jain ascetic, the monk or the nun. And we'll cover the Jain ascetic path in this lecture, part 1, as well as in a subsequent lecture in part 2. In this particular lecture, we're going to look at the following topics. We're going to look at various steps to liberation, or what are known as the stages of character, in Sanskrit gunasthana, in the Jain tradition. So this is another model of liberation in addition to the one that we looked at when we looked at the loka, all the different worlds. We're going to look carefully at the Jain monks and nuns, and we're going to also look at their Sanskrit names, because we've been calling them monks and nuns throughout this lecture series, but those words are, of course, Western words from, for example, the Christian tradition. And though they do share some similarities with Christian monks and nuns, there are very specific things about Jain monks and nuns that we're going to identify and point out throughout this lecture. We'll look at some of their reasons for renunciation, for example, and how those are very specific to the Jain tradition. And then we'll look at how they are initiated, both within the Digambara and the Svetamra sects, generally speaking. We'll look at, following that, some of the practices that they undertake. These include the 5 great vows, the 3 protections, and the 5 cares or regulations known as samiti. So these are ways that they attempt to perfect nonviolence. We'll have a discussion of how this all ties in with the notion of tapas or austerities, which, as you recall, is how one heats up the body to purify oneself. And then we'll end by looking at the 4-fold meditation schema within the Jain tradition. Just as an overview, as we dive into this lecture, Dundas points out that in the earliest texts, liberation can occur simply by following Mahavira's injunctions. So one can become liberated in this life, in one lifetime, by following the injunctions of Mahavira aimed at perfecting nonviolence and the eradication of all of one's karma, basically. However, this is gradually qualified, and as time goes on and texts develop and time passes after Mahavira's death, it is said that it takes 3 births time to achieve liberation. And by the early centuries of the Common Era, it becomes no longer possible in this era. Remember, we're in that downfall era in the 5th age of 6 ages to achieve liberation, right? So we're in such a bad state that really all we can do, as you see in bullet point number 4, is try to lead as good a life, as nonviolent a life as possible, to move toward gaining punya karma, remember that good karma for doing good things, just to ensure that we have a good rebirth into a good Jain family, or perhaps as a monk or a nun, some sort of ascetic in our next lifetime. We're just kind of hanging on and hanging in there as best we can until things start to get better and it will become possible to achieve liberation again. There's a 4-fold Jain community that evolves out of all of this, right? There are the lay people, the laymen and lay women, which we've talked about, the householders like you and I, and then there are the monks and the nuns, those ascetics who really take up the practice to perfect nonviolence more so than anyone else. This is known as the Chatur Vida Sangha. So it's a 4-fold community that is working together to live as nonviolent a life as possible, carry the Jain tradition forward. It's the lay people supporting the ascetics. And in this particular lecture, we're going to focus on the last 2 of these, the monks and the nuns. In order to achieve liberation, as you recall, one has to somehow make it up to the top, as you see here, of the Siddha Shila, to the Siddha Shila, the state of perfection, this place of perfection, of Siddha, perfection, or Siddha Loka, there are different names for it, but one has to make it there somehow by burning all of their karma, by living a very holy and nonviolent life. The idea of the gunastanas, which are actually steps towards liberation that you see here illustrated to the right, first come in an early century of the Common Era Digambara texts, and it describes how one can be liberated in one lifetime. Recall that early on it was possible to be liberated in one lifetime. In the current lifetime, however, and as we discussed in the previous slide, it's not possible in one lifetime anymore, generally speaking, to be liberated. So it is currently accepted broadly and generally that lay people and ascetics cannot go beyond the 5th or 6th step, as you see here, of the gunastanas. So you can see in the gunastanas to the right that there are 14 steps. It goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way up to number 14. One slowly burns through one's karma, at first as a householder and then eventually as an ascetic, as you see. And the idea here is that at some point you'll get through it all and be able to make it to the top rung and go into the Siddha Shila. However, it doesn't just work so easily. It's not just one step to the next. Indeed, one can fall back and backslide at any point. And for anyone who's ever been on a spiritual path or tried to commit to a spiritual path, you know that there's always some amount of backsliding. You make some progress, you overcome certain human traits about yourself that you don't really like, and then you slip back, you fall back, and you get back into old habits or old patterns, right? So this can happen in the gunastanas. You can go up, you can come back down. And in some cases, you can fall and you can fall hard. You can see the first step, the mithyatva gunastana, which is like a state of total delusion, is where you begin. And then you slowly start to live a more spiritual life, become more conscious, and ascend up these various steps. But you have to be careful not to become prideful and so on and so forth, because even when you get really high, all the way up, as you see, to the 8th step, where you're an ascetic, you see the ascetics in white there. Even when you get up to the 8th step, things can go haywire, and you could go all the way to step number 11, and then you can end up falling back down. So it's really crucial to get beyond that, to get beyond spiritual pride, arrogance, or anything like that, to be totally detached from all attachments, good or bad, punya or apunya or papa karma, and to ascend all the way to the top, right? So this is one way of understanding how one achieves liberation on the spiritual path, and it's still referred to, as you can see here, in these practical canons, as we discussed before, for contemporary Jains. Now, for the monks and nuns who are on this path or a similar path, there are some fundamental differences between the lifestyle that they live and the lifestyle that the householders live. Again, the monks and the nuns are more extreme because they have to perfect nonviolence. And indeed, if we look at the roots of what their original names were, we can really get a sense of what it was they were up to, right? One of the first words, and we've seen this before, that was used to refer to these Jain ascetics was nirgranta, as you see in the first bullet point, or niganta. There's different ways in Prakrit and Sanskrit to say this, but it basically means bondless. There's nothing tying you to the world. Your soul is on its way towards freedom, and you're not tied to this world. You're bondless. You're not bound. Granta can also refer to a knot, and nir means knot. So you're not tied down by a knot, right? You're not knotted down. You're not tied to the material or mental or emotional bonds of this earth. Another word that later develops to describe the Jain ascetics, as well as the Buddhist ascetics, is shramana, shram, which you see also in the first bullet point. Shramana comes from the verbal root in Sanskrit to strive after something, to strive after a goal, for example. In this case, they're striving after liberation beyond this world. This is why the name shramana can mean strivers. So these are some of the early terms that were used to describe these Jain ascetics who were striving after liberation and who did not have a lot of attachment or no attachment to this world. The male ascetics came to be called eventually muni, which can mean roughly sage, translated as sage, and comes from the same verbal root that can also mean just to be silent or to think, right? So there's an aspect of contemplation here, an aspect of not thinking too much or not talking too much, and really reflecting and going inward. So this word is also used this Sanskrit word muni is also used in other contexts, in Hindu contexts as well. But a muni is a male ascetic or a sage, one who has gone inward to experience liberation and the soul or the self. So that's a male monk, right? A muni. So I keep saying monk, but think of them as a muni. That's what they really are, okay? Female ascetics, on the other hand, are sometimes referred to as sadhvi. So the name sadhvi develops. Sadhvi can just simply mean in Sanskrit good, right? These are good people. These are good women going after a good goal, right? And as you see in the Digambara, sometimes they're called Aryaka. These are respectable women who are living very holy, spiritual lifestyles and are on the way as well towards liberation. Although, as we recall, in the Digambara tradition, they'll have to be reborn as a man because only then can they lose their clothes and be ultimately liberated. But within the Svetamra tradition, a sadhvi can, in this lifetime, potentially experience liberation just as a man can. So muni and sadhvi, these are the two different terms that were later developed to refer to what I'm calling the monks and the nuns, and is generally referred to in English as the monks and the nuns. In early texts, as Dundas points out, these monks and nuns were socially isolated, right? They were bondless, as you recall. They were shramana. They were striving after liberation. They were leaving society and, in fact, rejecting what society was all about. They were on the margins of society. They're out in the forests and the jungles and all the places where one would be isolated from the social bonds, and they're trying to achieve liberation. However, in the medieval period, this isolation became temporary, and it became temporary to perform various forms of asceticism and austerities. But as we'll recall from previous lectures, both within the Digambara and the Svetamra traditions, the temple dwelling practice begins to emerge, where monks and nuns begin to take refuge, not just for the time period of the monsoon, but for the whole year within temples. So the medieval period reflects a transition from living totally socially isolated from society to fully integrating with a lay community that would support them within these temples and within these lodgings and dwellings, where they could not only have a place to rest and be protected from the elements or attacks or nature, but also study and eat, right? And today, as Dundas points out, the idea of complete isolation, which was the original ideal, is mostly just that. It's an ideal. It's not something that people will generally do. And most all monks and nuns live in some form of symbiotic relationship with the lay people, are supported by the lay people, and will dwell in and around various lodgings and temples and receive alms frequently from them. Why do people renounce? According to Dundas, and just in general in spiritual life, one has a radical reorientation of their life and their perspective due to some kind of jolt in their life, right? Something wakes you up. And certainly, probably a lot of us have had that jolt, whether in our life we lost a loved one, or we lost a job, or just something fell apart. It causes us to wake up, or we get sick or something, right? And recover from sickness, or a loved one recovers from sickness. It gives you a renewed perspective on life. Well, for the Jains and for other religious traditions as well, these kind of radical reorientations due to these big jolts in life cause people to shift their spiritual perspective and perhaps, in the Jain tradition, renounce. There are, as Dundas points out, many reasons, and one text actually lists out 10 of them. So 10 specific reasons for renunciation. One has an individual desire, for example, number one. So you may feel compelled. Some people are just born, just like, for example, in the Catholic Church, some people feel called to be a priest or a nun. So you have your own desire, or perhaps you are just woken up by some life experience that causes you to want to become a monk or a nun, to renounce, right? Number two, anger with the world, anger with society, being fed up with the world, whatever it is you're angry about may compel you to want to just leave it all behind, renounce the world. Number three, poverty. Now, we've seen in certain cases that those who have converted historically to the Jain tradition were actually portrayed as impoverished. And this was seen as something kind of disgusting in the eyes of Hindus, for example, right? We remember the story of Virupaka, who lost all of his money to a prostitute, right? Well, those are, of course, stories that are meant to inflict unnecessary and untrue stereotypes upon the Jains. But it was the case, for example, that if you were in a lower class or caste within Hindu society, or you were poor or poor because of that, for example, you could convert to the Jain tradition, become an ascetic, and suddenly you would have a great deal of respect, right? So your willingness to live an impoverished life suddenly becomes quite admirable. You're doing it on your own accord, and you're doing it by your own choice and intention. So you could actually construct and turn your poverty into holy and saintliness. Number 4, a dream prompt. And how many of us have had dreams that have prompted us to do a lot of things? Dreams can wake us up. We can have dreams that change the direction of our life, or at least give us a clue or a hint towards what the right next step in life might be. So a dream prompt may, for example, cause a person in the Jain tradition to feel like it's time to become an ascetic. Number 5, there's a promise to leave the world. So if you don't like the world, you're angry with the world, you're just not wanting to be part of the social world per se in a typical householder way, the ascetic tradition offers another alternative where you can live a holy life, where you don't have all the bonds to this world, you're not totally attached to this world. So there's a promise to leave the world of social obligation and to achieve perhaps enlightenment or liberation. Number 6, memory of previous births. So you may in previous births remember that you had set a spiritual intention to eventually become an ascetic through your practice of spiritual perfection of nonviolence. For example, as we may recall, Mahavira, before he became the great Tirthankara that he was, had previous births where he was a lion, for example. And as a lion, he gave up his violence because he realized he had to kill to eat, eventually starved to death, and then became eventually born as Mahavira. So if you have a memory of an intention like that from a previous birth where you set the intention to not inflict violence because you knew it wasn't right, and then you realize that that can cause you to be liberated and that you're trying to burn away all your karma and all of the violence that you inflict, that's a very powerful reason to renounce. Some people talk about this as past life regression. You have a memory of a past life that changes the direction of your current life. So that may cause someone in the Jain tradition to renounce. Number 7, sickness. You may fall ill, or someone you know may fall ill. And if you fall ill and you recover, then you would like to renounce, right? Because then you realize how short and sweet life is, as well as the fact that you need to search for something, or at least be connected with something deeper than the ongoings of this ephemeral and temporary life. So that could compel you, being sick and or recovering from a sickness, to want to renounce. Number 8, lack of respect. So whatever your station in life is at a particular point in time, if you don't get a great deal of respect from your peers or from your community for what you do, you may leave that community, enter the Jain ascetic path, or even within the Jain tradition, you may renounce, because as a renunciant, as a monk or a nun, you get a great deal of respect for your asceticism, for the practices that you undertake and what you model for the rest of the community. Number 9, you might be enlightened by a god. And as you recall, the Tirthankaras all had some form of insight from some interaction with some celestial being or some god, or some insight that came from beyond. So something from beyond comes and tells you, delivers the message, it's time to wake up. It's time to renounce. It's time to go on the spiritual path. And number 10, you may simply follow your own child into the order of monks and nuns. If your child goes, if you are a widow, for example, and your child goes, maybe you will go into the order of renunciation just as your child does. So those are some of the main reasons that one of the texts that Dundas points out lists. So these are 10 really good reasons, and there are others, of course, for why one might go on the ascetic path and become a Jain ascetic. There are 2 forms of initiation, basically speaking, that you can take. The word for initiation, which is borrowed, of course, from the Sanskrit lexicon, is Diksha. You see here, Jain Diksha. In Jainism, or in the Jain tradition, Diksha is a rite of passage, right? A change of status, a formal change of status from householder to renunciate. You don't just do it. You don't just throw off all your clothes as a Digambara, for example, and just say, I'm a monk, right? Or put on your robes of a nun and say, I'm a nun. No, you have to go through a formal change of status that's very formal at a certain age in order to do that, and also very difficult in some ways. For Digambaras, only adults are allowed to renounce, and it first requires that you get permission from your parents, right? So parents oftentimes anywhere in the world, when they hear that their child wants to become a holy person, not just in the Jain tradition, but anywhere, would have some struggle with that at first, right? They want their children to go on and be prosperous and successful and so on and so forth. They don't want them to become spiritual. They want them to be worldly. They want them to take care of them as they get older, right? If your kid says, I'm going to go on the spiritual path, that's a cause for concern for parents. So you have to get their permission first and say farewell. You also have to approach an initiating teacher. So you can't just become, generally speaking, a Jain or a Jain renunciate. You must have a teacher, another renunciate, ascetic, monk, or nun who's willing to initiate you and teach you on the path. Number 3, once you've done that, you then have to abandon your clothing. For the Digambaras, that would be, of course, just for the males. You abandon your clothing. For the nuns, you have to wear clothing, as you recall. But for the males, you have to abandon all your clothes as a sign of non-possession and non-violence. You have to take ascetic vows and take on a new ascetic name. So you're making a vow, first and foremost, of course, to non-violence, non-possession, and so forth, and take on a new name, a new identity as an ascetic, right? To show that you're leaving the householder life, the life of worldliness, into the life of spiritual practice. And finally, you have to take your whisk. The whisk is the peacock feather whisk, to wipe away in front of you everywhere you walk microorganisms and bugs so you don't step on them, and a water pot to carry your water, right? So you'll recall that these are 2 of the 3 main things that a Digambara monk will have, the only things, which is the whisk, the water pot, and their scriptures, right? They even have to, as you see here, pull all of their hair out. Okay, so this is an ascetic practice that's part of the initiation, where all of your hair has to be pulled out as an ascetic practice. It's very painful, and I'm going to play you a short video here so you can see what that looks like. So this is really showing a full commitment to get over yourself, get over your attachment to suffering and to your pride in your appearance. So see what that looks like. So as you can see, this is done very slowly, 1 hair at a time, or 1 little chunk of hair at a time. And for anyone who's ever had hair pulled out, 1 out of the head, but even worse, out of the face, you know this is an incredibly painful process. And so you can see that there's a great amount of reserve and power that these Digambaras have as they enter and continue on the spiritual path and make the commitment to undertaking such painful austerities. But what appears to be some kind of a nasty or outdated practice is actually firmly grounded in a commitment to not being of this world or this body or this mind, being fully committed to the soul and not to the world, right? To committing things to yourself that will take away pride, take away ego, and so on and so forth, and burn your karma, okay? So this is still remains a very important practice to this day, and you can see it here being practiced by these Digambara monks. For Svetamra initiation, also called Diksha, The minimum age is 8 years. So for Digambaras, you have to be an adult, but the minimum age is 8 years. And that's for the Terapantis only. The Terapantis are one of the aniconic sects that we've seen before and we'll look at more in the future. But you have to be a minimum of 8 years old. So that's pretty young, right? And there are 2 steps here with the Svetambaras, generally speaking. There's a little initiation, the Choti Diksha, and then there is the big initiation, the Body Diksha. The little initiation is a declaration of sincerity, right? This is just to show on a 1-month period for a 1-month probation that you're serious. I want to be initiated, but let me try this out. It involves fasting, which is very difficult, not taking food for a certain period of time, as well as study of the scriptures. If after that month you feel like you can commit to this, then you can take the big initiation, the Body Diksha. Here you will go through a hair pulling ceremony, not unlike the one that we just saw with the Digambaras. You will be given a bowl, okay, a begging bowl to receive your alms, a robe, as you see the young monk to the right, as well as a whisk to wipe away the animals or the microorganisms in front of you as you walk. And if you're in one of the aniconic sects, you also receive a mupati. A mupati is the mouth cover that goes over your mouth that prevents you from, among other things, breathing in microorganisms or reminds you not to say anything that might be violent. Okay, so we see there's some overlap between Svetamra and Digambara initiation, though there are some things that are unique. One of the things that all Jains would share is the commitment to the 5 great vows, or vrata. These are also called the Mahavrata, the great vows in Sanskrit. Maha means great, and vrata means vow. The Mahavrata are a central defining characteristic of Jain asceticism, as Dundas points out, and as any Jain will tell you. It is these 5 vows, which we'll look at in a moment, that all Jains must commit to, whether lay or ascetic, but the ascetics will take them again to their extreme in terms of practice, more so than the householders. They're accepted by both sects, as I said, and they're intended for self-purification. These 5 vows are intended to purify one, to make one a holy person who has perfected nonviolence and eventually achieve liberation. In the earliest texts, nonviolence and non-possession were the most important, or were the vows that had to be taken. So there were these 2 main vows in the earliest texts, such as the Acharanga Sutra, that tells the story of Mahavira and how he achieved liberation. As you'll recall, when he was meditating outside in nature with his eyes open, he realized nothing wanted to be hurt, and he made a fundamental commitment to non-violence, right? And he had already made a commitment to non-possession because he had given away all his belongings and was basically wandering around naked. So in the earliest texts, the first 2 of these 5 vows, non-violence and non-possession, are there and are extremely important. Later on, 3 more will be added in various ways. As we saw in a previous lecture, some, I believe in the Svetamra sect, believe that that Parshva, the 23rd Tirthankara, actually gave the first 4, okay, non-violence all the way through to number 4. And then Mahavira added the 5th, celibacy, right? So there's different versions of how this happened, but the important thing to recognize is that non-violence is at the root of all of these, as well as non-possession, and then the others are added on later. But they're all grounded in an ethic of non-violence. The 5 vows are, of course, non-violence, we saw throughout this lecture series, not lying, satya, not stealing, asteya, sexual restraint, brahmacharya, and 5, non-possession, aparigraha. So this is how they are classically listed. And then there's even a 6th bonus one, which says don't eat after dark. Why not? Well, there's a lot of reasons, but one of which is you have to light a fire that will attract insects and maybe kill insects, right? Or you might not see an insect in your food and accidentally eat it. That would commit a form of violence. But the first 5, 1 through 5, are the core 5 great vows of the Jain tradition and remain relevant in practice and committed to this day. As you can see in the image to the right from New Delhi, there is a picture of a cow and a lion, both eating or drinking from the same water trough. This image is famous and depicts a commitment to nonviolence and what the world could look like, right? Because normally the lion and the cow would not be getting along so well. There would be a violent interaction between them. But as you can see, they're even sharing each other's milk, because if you look down at the little children that are drinking from the cow and from the mother lioness, you can see that the baby lion is drinking from the cow, and the baby cow is drinking from the lion. So there's an idea here that we can all get along, and we can all share, and we can all commit ourselves to nonviolence, and the world will go on. Okay, so this is taken inspiration from the Jain tradition and its fundamental commitment to living a life of nonviolence. Two quotes are often used by Jains to encapsulate their religion and this commitment to nonviolence. The first one that you'll often hear is number one, ahimsa paramo dharmaha, right? So the first of the 5 great vows, nonviolence is the highest. And ahimsa paramo dharmaha means nonviolence is the highest virtue or dharma or responsibility of all beings, right? It's universal and all must commit to this. Number 2, the second quote often used by Jains, parasparo pagraho jivanam. Parasparo pagraho jivanam. The function of souls is to help one another. And I believe I've taken that translation from Shugen Jain at the International School for Jain Studies. And isn't it a beautiful quote? The function of souls, all of our responsibility is to fundamentally to help one another, be nonviolent, and help one another. So these are often quoted even to this day to encapsulate what it is the Jain tradition is trying to promote for world society, both historically and now contemporaneously. They come from, as you see in bullet point number 2, the central insight in the Acharanga Sutra, one of the earliest texts, perhaps the earliest texts of the Jain tradition, that all souls are like oneself, right? They all suffer distress. They all cling to life, value their life, and they do not wish to be injured, right? It's so simple and yet so true. And so the fundamental commitment to nonviolence, to compassion, comes from this fundamental and really universal, and I don't know how you can argue with, insight, right? All beings suffer distress, all cling to life, and no one wants to be injured, right? Unless they willingly want to be injured. But generally speaking, people do not want to be injured, and neither do animals, plants, bugs, anything, right? So we have to try our best to perfect nonviolence. This is often, again, enacted through Jain diet, as well as other lifestyle commitments to not eating animals or using animal products even. And as I've mentioned before, there is a movement within the Jain tradition to be not only vegetarian and to promote vegetarianism and a vegetarian lifestyle, but also a vegan lifestyle, given the horrific violence of the factory farming industry throughout the world and animal husbandry, and the violence that even, having to have milk or yogurt can inflict upon, for example, a cow, right? Or a chicken to lay your egg for your breakfast requires quite a bit of distress and suffering on account of the chickens that are part of that system. So those are just some examples, but they acknowledge that if you consume those types of products, you are participating in a system that causes great distress, injury, and ultimately death for these animals. There is, in some instances, and I've mentioned this before, the possibility that one can inflict violence, and this is called prevention violence, virodhi himsa. We've talked about this before. We've seen certain Jains call kings, for example, in the Hoysala dynasty, we saw a Jain Digambara suggest to the king that it's okay in self-defense to defend your country, right? To defend your land. We have seen that it's okay for monks to protect nuns, right? If the nuns are being attacked or the monks themselves are being attacked, in the history of the Jain tradition, virodhi himsa would be invoked to save and protect the order, to keep the Jain teachings going forward. You have to inflict some violence only to defend yourself. So this is prevention violence, or almost like self-defense. And I think I've also mentioned in a previous lecture that there are nuns who are trained in martial arts today, Jain nuns in India, to protect them from the violence that is inflicted upon them out in society at large. Okay, so although there is a fundamental commitment to nonviolence, if there is violence inflicted upon a Jain that threatens their life and the life of the Sangha, of the teachings of the Jain tradition, then it's okay to defend yourself. So this is acts of self-defense, It is not offensive acts against anyone. So in addition to the 5 great vows, right, ahimsa being the highest of them, nonviolence, there are 3 protections that all the ascetics must commit themselves to, and they're implied in the 5 great vows, right? Because they are implied in that they connect to the idea or the vow of nonviolence, and they prevent new karma, and they do so by regulating one's mind, body, and speech, right? Be mindful of what you're thinking, be mindful of what you're doing with your body, and be mindful of what you say. If all 3 of those things are purified of violence, your thoughts, your actions, and your words, then you are on the path towards burning karma, then you are on the path towards liberation. So these are implied, but very important, right? It's even in thought and intention. What's in your mind matters, because it could lead to certain forms of action or lead you to say things that are not so nice. There are also 5 careful actions that Jains commit themselves to, and Jain ascetics specifically. These are: number 1, care in motion, irya samiti. So be careful how you move. Every step you take has the potential to cause violence, right? And that's why we've seen the monks and nuns will have the whisk that they wipe away microorganisms and bugs in front of them with, because they want to be careful as they're moving not to cause any violence, because any amount of violence that is inflicted causes karma to adhere to your soul, which causes you to be further bound in this world. The second one is care in speech, vasa samiti. Care in speech ties right in with that gupti, the protection, to be mindful of what you say. So use words as little as possible, and when you need to use them as efficiently as possible. Don't use any violence in what you say. Make sure what you say is well thought out. Number 3, care in begging, asna samiti. There are a lot of rules with regard to how ascetics can beg. For example, ascetics are not supposed to take food that was specifically prepared for them, because anything that happened in the preparation of that food would be tied to them, right? Because it was prepared for them. They instead, for example, have to take food that is leftovers that was not prepared for them. So that's care in begging, asna samiti. Number 4, adana nikshepana samiti, care in receiving or setting down items. So how one receives items or sets them down, right? You have to be very careful, because by moving something or receiving something, you might inflict some kind of violence on a microorganism or a bug or anything like that, right? You have to be really careful how you move and how you move objects and items. Everything counts here, as you can see. It's extreme in the sense that it's trying to perfect nonviolence. And number 5, utsarga samiti, care in defecation. Be careful where you go to the bathroom, right? This may sound weird, but where one goes to the bathroom can have effects on other people, can cause violence, can cause sickness, can cause microorganisms to die. There's all sorts of reasons why you have to be careful in where you defecate, okay? So these are obviously coming from older texts. However, these are still things that are taken into consideration in the Jain tradition in an effort to help one perfect nonviolence, right? They are that nuanced, and they are that specific, and they are that detailed, because in order to perfect nonviolence, you have to really be thinking about the nitty gritty, all these little things, right? All these fine details count, especially in the ascetic tradition, because you're going for liberation. All of these things are grounded in an ethic or an ethos of tapas, or austerity, which we've talked a lot about throughout this lecture series. All the vows, all the protections, all the careful actions are grounded in tapas, right? This idea that you're heating up your body to burn your karma. Because indeed, if you think about what it takes to do all those things that I've just mentioned to you, for example, to be careful in your movement, right? To sweep the ground in front of you with every step that you take is not an easy thing to do. It creates internal suffering, what we might think of as internal suffering, but would be interpreted in the Jain tradition as heat, tapas, purifying heat, that is actually burning away karma to liberate your soul. So this is how those types of activities are being connected to Jain karma theory, right? They're not just doing it just to perfect nonviolence for the sake of perfecting nonviolence. No, they're trying to do it because any form of violence causes that karma to stick to your body, and it must be burned away. So that's where this idea of tapas comes in, to burn away karma through all the practices that we've looked at in this lecture. It is very difficult to perform tapas, obviously, as we've said, and you see in bullet point number 2. However, great glory is earned, as we will recall, for example, from the tapa gacha in the Svetamra tradition that we looked at. The founder of the tapa gacha was given his name, and the gacha, the family, the group, was given its name because the founder was able to perform such extreme tapas and austerities. He was respected for it, and he had a great following for it, right? You get great glory. Great glory is earned for your practice of austerity, because people can look up to you and see that it is possible to be a better person than we think we can be. They are role models, right? Tapas also prevents one from being reborn in hell, right? So the physical pain that is required for fasting and so on, and all the other things that we've looked at, is seen as not only potentially giving us a better birth in the future because we've burned away a lot of our bad karma, but it also is seen as preventing us from going downward in the chain of life, right? Or the chain of rebirth, which could potentially put one in hell. So it prevents us from being reborn into hell. It seems like it's worth enduring in this particular lifetime. There are 12 austerities total. So we're talking about austerities, tapas, right? You see in this slide. As we move forward, there are 6 external austerities specifically, and then 6 internal austerities. They're all tied back to the vows and the protections and the careful actions. This is really how you're acting out those various vows and protections and actions, right? The external austerities are 1, fasting. So not taking food for a period of time, which is creates a lot of internal heat, that tapas, right? To burn away karma. Number 2, reduction of food intake, right? So not only do you fast periodically, but you don't eat as much. Number 3, make alms begging difficult. Make it difficult for yourself to get food. For example, the temple dwelling monks, as we saw, were seen as being too lax. It was too easy because they were living in temples and it was easy for them to get food, right? If you make it more difficult for yourself, you're going to burn more karma, because the harder your life is, the more glory and the more austerities that you will be producing within your body. So make it hard for yourself to get food. Don't make it so easy. Number 4, give up flavor substances. So don't eat things that you like. Just eat bland food just to sustain your body. Don't do it for enjoyment, because any enjoyment will create an attachment. Number 5, enter temporary solitude. For anyone who's ever been alone for a period of time and isolated, it can get quite lonely. And in that solitude, use that loneliness to reflect, to produce that internal heat, that discomfort, to burn your karma, right? And number 6, bodily mortification. So you can do various things to your body, and there were things that were done to people's bodies and continue to be done within ascetic traditions, just broadly speaking, in India. One of the things that you've seen, this is not something Jains do, but that you may have seen, is that some ascetics will hold their arm up for like years at a time and not put it down. And what ends up happening is their arm atrophies and it gets stuck in this upward position. It's very uncomfortable, but it's seen as an austerity. It's uncomfortable, but it's producing heat in their body. And it's basically showing that they've overcome their body with the hope of achieving something beyond their body, right? So bodily mortification can take a lot of forms. In the Jain tradition, one of them might just be fasting, right? Or even, as we'll see, fasting to death at the end of one's life when one is sick. So those are the 6 external austerities. The 6 internal austerities are more mental, emotional austerities, right? They're intended to diminish egocentricity. So if the external austerities are giving up things on the outside, like food and so forth in your body and whatnot, the physical things, the internal austerities are intended to change the way you think, right? To purify your mind, diminish your egocentricity. The first of these is atonement for faults that you have committed. So for any faults that you have committed, wrongdoings you have done for others, to others, including not just humans, but to all of life, the entire web of life, you have to ask for forgiveness on a regular basis. Number 2, we have respect for your superiors and the Jain truth. So even though you may not like what your superiors tell you, if you've committed yourself to an acharya or a teacher or a guru within the Jain tradition, you have to have great respect for them, obey them, and have a firm commitment through that right darshana, that right faith, right, the right vision to the Jain truth, the way that Jainism understands reality to be shaped and the way that one can get out of it. So have respect for that. Have respect for the tradition and those who teach it. Number 3, give service to your fellow ascetics. So you're not practicing all of these things on your own. You're part of a gacha, for example, right? You're part of one of these clans, one of these family groups who are practicing each and supporting one another in their spiritual and religious undertakings. Help your fellow ascetics. There are going to be older ones who need your help. Be of service to them. Help those who are sick. Help those who are struggling. Okay, so it's a support group as well. This causes internal austerity because you have to overcome your own selfishness and desires in order to help others. Number 4, study and reflection. So continue to study, as you see this gentleman here to the right, studying his scriptures and reflect on the meaning of the Jain scriptures. What do they mean? Reflect on karma theory, reflect on the path to liberation, reflect on nonviolence and so forth, right? The image that we see here to the right is a Westerner who was sharing on his blog for a while his time spent as a Jain ascetic, right? So here we have a Westerner committing to the study and reflection of the Jain scriptures and way of life. Number 5, give up personal attachments. So all the little things that you're attached to, those are all ego desires, individual desires that must be given up. And number 6, meditation. Meditate. Meditation, sitting still for even a minute with your eyes closed or open, is a difficult thing to do, right? Your mind will start to wander and go crazy and so on and so forth. Meditate. As Dundas points out, meditation and the practice of meditation was mostly lost with the Purvas. The Purvas, as you may recall, are those texts in the Jain tradition that were mostly oral and were forgotten and lost, right? So most of the meditation practices were lost with the Purvas, although they were resuscitated much later, as we'll see now, in the 11th century of the Common Era. So this last of the 6 internal austerities, meditation, sitting still, and burning away your karma by sitting still in your egocentricity, were revived in the 11th century, and we'll see what that looks like now. So in the Jain tradition, broadly speaking, Dundas points out a basic 4-fold meditation schema. These are 1, anguished, and 2, angry. So those are the first 2, right? As Dundas points out, and the Jain tradition points out, these are unhealthy forms of meditation and are connected to the sense pleasures, right? So if you're anguished, such as this poor woman is to the right who really wants to eat that cake, as am I looking at that cake, wanting to eat that cake right now, you're not helping yourself towards liberation, right? So as I'm craving to eat that piece of chocolate sitting next to the cake right there, I'm creating an attachment to something outside of myself through my senses, right? And as you may be too, looking at that cake thinking, that looks delicious, you're committing yourself to an attachment of the senses, which prevents you from attaining liberation and creates more karma, right? So all of us who have looked at this piece of cake and chocolate right now have just had a few more karmic particles attached to our soul. The other one is angry, right? Number 2. So when you're angry, this is not healthy. It means there's something outside of you or inside of you that's bothering you. And that causes more karma to attach to you, right? Anger is one of the big no-nos, right? It's connected to the ego, and it's connected to this second of the 4-fold meditation schema that is unhealthy, right? So when you meditate or have thoughts on things that you want, sense pleasure things, right? Or if you're trying to meditate and then you start to think of things outside yourself that you want to do or consume and so on and so forth, or that you're angry about, you're not helping yourself at all. Instead, what you have to do is move on to stages 3 and 4, virtuous and bright, okay? For virtuous meditation, the third stage, the third stage in this meditation schema, you're reflecting on how rebirth occurs. Okay, so now you're woken up to thinking about how, because of all your attachments, because of all your anguish and anger and all the other things that you're attached to, you're thinking about how those cause you to be reborn over and over again. Because if you die with attachments, for example, or karma. If you die with these karmic particles on your soul, you're going to have to be reborn again in another life as a human, or worse, as a hell being or something, in order to burn that karma away, right? So if you're reflecting on how this process occurs, rebirth, death and rebirth, reincarnation, transmigration, that's seen to be virtuous meditation, right? That's a good thing to be reflecting on that, because it's going to cause you to act differently. It may even cause you, as we saw before, to renounce and to become a renouncer, because you don't want to be reborn again because life is suffering. And number 4, bright or shukla. Number 4 is something that may have been added later to show that meditation can actually lead to liberation, right? For example, for Mahavira, he attained liberation, right? So number 3 gets you to reflect on the process of rebirth. And then number 4, if it was added later, or no matter when it was added, is intended to show that meditation itself can lead to liberation. So that reflection on how rebirth occurs and an adjustment of your life according to Jain vows and praxis can lead you eventually through meditation and all the other austerities that we saw before to some form of freedom and liberation, right? And we see in the bottom image here, this wonderful image from India. We see a man sitting down, reflecting and meditating on the Tirthankara, who's sitting in perfect equipoise, right, in that Shukla state, and has been liberated. So you can take great inspiration from the Tirthankaras, like Mahavira and so forth, who have themselves gone through this process and have shown that it is possible for us all. And finally, there's a medieval fourfold pattern that arises, right? So these meditation practices are coming back during the medieval period, right? They're lost with the Purvas and then being resuscitated in various ways. This is a famous way that it was resuscitated. A Digambara named Shubhachandra wrote a text called the Gyanarnava, the ocean of knowledge. And within this ocean of knowledge text, there's a fourfold pattern of meditation that one undertakes to burn away their karma and ultimately realize their soul, right? Number 1, pinda, the first stage. Destroy your 8 karmas by imagining them as objects. So in the Jain tradition, and we mentioned this briefly before, there are 8 basic forms of karma. 4 of them are non-harming, the other 4 are harming. But nevertheless, all 8 of them eventually have to go away in order to be ultimately and forever liberated, right? So in the Pinda meditation, you're imagining these 8 karmas as objects within yourself and then destroying them. Wow, right? Very powerful way of visualization of the karmas and getting rid of them, and reminding yourself every day through this meditation that you have to get rid of them, right? And if you don't, you won't be liberated. Number 2, pada. Pada refers to chanting mantras, so those sacred sounds, as summations of scriptural knowledge. So you chant mantras, sounds, that are intended, like, for example, in the sutras, like the Yoga Sutras or other sutra texts, where the sounds are meant to encapsulate summations of scriptural knowledge to remind you of the spiritual teachings. So not only are you visualizing your karmas as being destroyed, you're reminding yourself of scriptural knowledge in a condensed form, right? Of all the karma theory and so on and so forth, all the things in Jain scripture that you need to be aware of to be liberated. Number 3, rupa. You then contemplate the form of the Ford makers for inspiration. And as we'll see in a future lecture, the Ford makers, because they are not gods, and because they are liberated and beyond this world and don't have any care or concern for intervening in human affairs, are looked up to by Jains for inspiration. Because if they have made it, if they have perfected nonviolence, so too can we. So rupa, contemplate the Ford makers, contemplate their perfection, and use that for your own inspiration to eventually become liberated. If not in this lifetime, then somewhere down the line. Burn that karma, right? They did it, you can do it. And number 4, rupatita, contemplation of that which is beyond form. And this is ultimately where all of this is headed, right? Because in the Jain tradition, we're trying to liberate our omniscient soul from the karmic bond it has to our mind, body, and the world and our senses. So in the Rupatita stage, the 4th stage, you get to the point where you can contemplate that which is beyond all of this form even beyond the form makers, beyond scriptural knowledge, beyond all the karmas. There's something pure that you've been working toward, and that is your omniscient, blissful, energetic soul. And it's there. And that is where this is all headed. Nevertheless, as Dundas points out, meditation is not practiced by Jain ascetics in any meaningful way today. Okay, so although these meditation practices exist in texts, they aren't necessarily being practiced by the ascetics in any meaningful way today. What's more important and primary for any ascetic today is the demonstration of nonviolence, scriptural knowledge, and so forth, and to act and to show through praxis and through spiritual practice how to be a good Jain. Now, we will see that there are forms of Jain meditation that have been renewed in the modern period, and we'll look at a little bit about that, about how they were developed in a future lecture. But for now, suffice it to say that meditation isn't as central as it may perhaps have been back in these medieval texts that were also drawing from tantric traditions and so on and so forth, and were being practiced in the medieval period. So that concludes our lecture on Jain asceticism. It's the first of 2 lectures that we'll do that will cover this topic, and there's a lot more to look at, and we'll look at that in the one that follows. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you then.